All right, so tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about more social history. So how did the lives of the peasants and the nobles differ in the 18th century? So the first question we're going to talk about is, how would you describe the British nobility in terms of politics and economy? And I've kind of mentioned this a little bit in class, the difference between the French nobility and the British nobility. So the British nobility was the smallest and the wealthiest in all of Europe, but it was also the best defined and the most socially responsible in Europe. It was really only about 400 families that made up the British aristocracy. And it was the eldest male that had the seat in the House of Lords. So the eldest male held the seat in the House of Lords. So like I was saying, it was the eldest male who held a seat in the House of Lords. And the estates would range that the nobles owned from a few thousand to 50,000 of acres. So some estates were as large as 50,000 acres. And they basically owned, these 400 families owned a quarter of all the arable land in Britain. But this group invested in trade, in canals, in urban real estate, in mines, and in industry. Partly because they did have more of a sense of political and social responsibility because they were sitting in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords really was running the government in England, or at least running the parliament. The younger sons did not inherit because there's something called primogeniture, so only the oldest son inherited. So as a result, the younger sons would work in trade, they would go into the army, they would go into various different professions, and then they would go into the church. Because they were in Parliament, and Parliament has the power of the purse strings, they were levying taxes, but they also paid them. They had very few legal privileges, unlike the French nobility, but they had a great deal of political power in the system. So now let's look a little bit about how would the French nobles be different from the British. So for the French nobles, there were about 400,000 nobles in all of France, and they were divided between the nobles of the sword, who had gotten their nobility from military service, and what was called the nobles of the robe, who had gotten their nobility by serving in the government bureaucracy or who had purchased them. And then it was further divided by those who had favor at Versailles and those who did not. And those people who did have favor at Versailles gained a great deal of wealth by having a court office, having some sort of job in the government. The provincial nobles, the nobles in the countryside, really were basically just wealthy peasants. All the nobles in France, though, had certain hereditary privileges, like they were exempt from taxes, they were exempt from the corvée, which was the forced labor. They could collect feudal dues from their tenants, and they had, as we were talking about this in class, they had exclusive hunting and fishing privileges. So now let's look at the nobles of Eastern Europe. So why would the Eastern European nobility be more oppressive and militaristic? So military traditions remained very, very strong in Eastern Europe. Poland, the nobles were completely exempt from taxes, and until 1768 had the power in life and of death over their serfs. In Austria, they had judicial powers and they had some tax exemption. In Prussia, they were referred to as the Junkers, and they had a great deal of power since they were the officers in the army. And in Russia in the 18th century, the position of nobles, the boyars, was linked to state service. So state service was linked to your noble status. Russian nobles probably had the most power over their serfs than anybody else. All right, so now let's look at the question, how do you think the nobles responded to the expanding power of the monarchs? So it made it more difficult to become a noble as the monarchs were trying to gain more power in an absolute system. They would reserve appointments to the officer corps of the armies, the highest levels of the bureaucracy, the government ministries, and the church. All of these positions were just for the nobles. So if you were going to be a top position in the military, if you were going to have a top job in the government, if you're going to have top jobs in the church, only for the nobles. And the power of the existing aristocratically controlled institutions tried to stand up against the power of the monarchy. So there's kind of this power struggle that's going on. And they tried to improve their financial status by getting either more tax exemptions or by getting higher or collecting higher rents from their people. But bottom line, there's this power struggle that's going on between the monarchs as the monarchs are trying to become, more absolute and consolidate their power more, and the nobles are trying to kind of fight against that. So, how do you think the nobles responded? Oh, why do I have that question there? That shouldn't be that question. Sorry. Question 5 should be, I don't know why I had that there. Sorry. How did the peasants and serfs live compared to the nobles? Is going to be the next question. So, the nobles and the serfs obviously lived very different lives. So, basically, the majority of the people in any country were your poor peasants living off the land. About 80% of the population made money by living off the land. The output, the agricultural output, was very low. Basically, their yields, their productive yields, have not really grown that much since the 13th century or even since the times of ancient Greece. The methods really of agriculture were more ancient and medieval than modern. So every 8 or 9 years, a harvest would fail. It would either be a poor harvest or it would fail completely. And really, a peasant family can only survive one season of a bad harvest. More than 1 year of a bad harvest, basically you're going into the issue that there's going to be mass starvation. And at that point, they would start eating what we refer to as famine foods, the bark off of trees, weeds, and in some extreme cases, they would resort to cannibalism. Disease and epidemics were incredibly common since the people were just so weakened from malnutrition. There was a whole series of diseases that were like famine diseases. No matter what rights the peasants had in the government, the great landlords controlled the local government and the courts, and they were the people that made the laws. So really, the peasants had no political power. They were subject to paying feudal dues, whether they owned the land or not. They would have to rent land to feed their families. They would have to rent use of the mill to grind their grain. They'd have to pay to use the ovens to bake their bread. Most peasants also still had some sort of forced labor that were required to do, like in France, the corvée. And the Russian nobles measured their wealth by the number of souls or male serfs they possessed. In Russia, they could require them to work up to 6 days a week. The boyars could exile them to Siberia, and really, basically, the peasants had no power against the whims of the landlords. They were completely at the landlord's mercy. Peasant revolts, as a result, were common, especially in Eastern Europe, and sometimes England as well. And it was aimed at property, not people. And it was usually aimed at, or triggered if they lost some sort of traditional right that the peasants had always had. Now, fields were completely left open and were divided into long strips, which was farmed as a community. So this is where, when we look forward to the Industrial Revolution, we start talking about things called the Enclosure Acts, where they began enclosing this land, which is pretty much open. Half the land would stay fallow to prevent crop failures, and then in more fertile fields, there would be a 3-field system where they would rotate a third of the land. And then there would be common fields that were used for the grazing of the animals. And life was really, really hard, since everyone only had a share of the meager yield of the peasants. They really, again, weren't producing that much, and they were pretty much feeding this whole system. So, the next question, how did the agricultural revolution improve the lives of the peasants, but also hurt the peasants? So with the agricultural revolution, now this is going to be in the late 1600s into the early 1700s, and this is going to be the trigger that's going to lead up, at least in places like England, to the Industrial Revolution. So think it back to what we talked about in AP World when we talked about the Industrial Revolution. With no agricultural revolution, there could not have been an Industrial Revolution in Europe. So starting of the things that starts to happen is they begin to eliminate leaving the fields fallow. That's going to increase the yield by 50% right there. And what they're going to start to do is realize that grain eliminates nitrogen from the fields. And that's why fields lose their fertility. So what you need to do is you need to alternate it with crops that bring nitrogen into the soil, like peas, beans, turnips, potatoes, clover. So by rotating the field, that allows you to, the crop that's grown in the fields, that's going to allow you to use and plant that field every year. Also, there was new crops that were being used to feed the animals, so people were beginning to build up their herds, and more animals meant more fertilizer and more meat, more protein in people's diets, and that meant better nutrition. So that takes us to the last question for today's discussion. Why would the peasants be unwilling to kind of take on and try some new ideas? So people experimenting in these new ways of agriculture leading to the agricultural revolution felt they couldn't really do so effectively in the open field system. They wanted to enclose portions of the fields. And this met with a lot of resistance from the poor peasants who had basically the most to lose. They were really steeped in tradition, and they were really resistant to change, and they were unwilling to face the risks. Because remember, a failed harvest, 2 failed harvests means starvation. So they were very slow to change over. Russia still had open fields all the way up until 1917, to the Russian Revolution. It's mostly England and what we call the Low Countries, would be like the Netherlands and Belgium. That's the only places in Europe that it really was used extensively. And by 1870, English farmers were able to increase their yields by 300% from what the yields were in 1700, while only increasing labor by 14%. Lands in England were enclosed in a series of enclosure acts. As a result of this, many peasants lost land. And the landless peasants lost access to the common fields. And the landless peasants needed the common fields because that was the only way they could survive. Most of the land was owned by a small percentage of very rich landowners. And the tenant farmers basically were the peasants that were paying a rent, and they were helping to finance the big landowners. But they improved the fields and the methods of farming, and they began to provide wage labor for the landless peasants. But the peasants lost independence, and they lost self-respect that they were given by having the common fields. So I want you to think about this, because this is going to set the stage up. This situation with the nobles is going to set the stage up for the French Revolution, which we've been talking about in class already. And the agricultural revolution in England and the Netherlands is going to set the stage up for an eventual industrial revolution. So I want you to kind of think about all these things, why these things were happening in Europe at this time.